May 1945. A gray dawn crept through the shattered windows of a former German field hospital near Nuremberg. Rain tapped softly against the metal roof, mingling with the low hum of a generator that never stopped groaning. Inside, the air smelled of ether, sweat, and the lingering rot of war. German nurses stood motionless by the doorway, their uniforms stripped of insignia, hands clasped tight behind their backs. They had served under the Red Cross of the Reich. Now they stood under the flag of their conquerors. An American doctor entered, his sleeves rolled up, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He set down his instruments, glanced toward the silent women, and said through an interpreter, "We need hands." He was a cyst. The chosen nurse froze. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She had been trained to treat her own, never them. But the order was clear. She stepped forward, trembling, as an American soldier lay on the table, his blood spreading through the sheets. Somewhere outside, church bells rang for the end of the war. Inside, the fight to save a single life had just begun. In the spring of 1945, Germany was a nation of hospitals turned to ruins and cities that had become open graves. The war's final months had left behind not only wreckage but an empire of the wounded. In every captured town, churches became infirmaries, schools became triage stations, and basements became operating rooms. The once-ordered medical network of the Reich had collapsed. Supplies were gone, doctors scattered, and the nurses, a mostly young women who had served since their teenage years and were among the last. Remnants of a broken system trying to keep breathing bodies alive amid defeat. The Allied advance into southern Germany came swiftly and without pause. In early April, U.S. forces under General Alexander Patch's 7th Army crossed into Bavaria, sweeping through towns that had only days before sworn loyalty to Hitler. With them came the U.S. Army Medical Corps, mobile field hospitals, surgical units, and medics hardened by years in France and the Ardennes. Their orders were twofold: treat their own wounded and provide humanitarian care to German civilians and prisoners of war. But no manual prepared them for the reality they found: hospitals filled with starving civilians, amputees without anesthesia, and German nurses who had continued their duties even as the Reich crumbled around them. For the German medical staff, the surrender did not bring relief. It brought terror. They had been told for years that capture meant humiliation, that Allied soldiers would torture them, that women would suffer unspeakable things. Many burned their uniforms or tried to hide their Red Cross armbands, fearing it would brand them as collaborators with the Nazi state. Yet in the confusion of occupation, the Americans needed them. The war's last battles had created tens of thousands of casualties, both Allied and Axis, and there were not enough trained hands to tend to the wounded. In Bavaria and Austria, captured hospitals were quickly converted into joint facilities. The Americans brought morphine, gauze, and blood plasma. The German staff provided knowledge of the local population and medical records. But the air between them was cold with suspicion. The Americans saw former enemies. The Germans saw occupiers who might at any moment turn their authority into vengeance. For many of the women, the war had begun when they were barely adults. The Nazi regime had elevated nursing as a patriotic duty, not only a profession but a symbol of loyalty to the fatherland. Posters from the 1930s showed young women in crisp white uniforms, smiling beside wounded soldiers. Slogans reading, "The German nurse, faithful daughter of the nation." By 1943, most were conscripted into military service. They followed divisions into the front lines, serving under the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe medical units, often within artillery range. Some were trained under the National Socialist Sisterhood, which combined medical discipline with ideological indoctrination. They were told that mercy was for Germans, not for the enemy. When the Reich fell, that belief system shattered overnight. But the indoctrination lingered in instinct. For these women, the enemy was not only the man with a foreign uniform, it was the loss of everything they had been taught to believe. American doctors faced their own struggle. Many had lost comrades in the Battle of the Bulge or in the liberation of camps like Dachau, which revealed horrors beyond imagination. To ask them to now trust German nurses, to share instruments and lives with those once complicit in the same machinery, was almost unthinkable. Yet pragmatism overrode emotion. Disease and infection were spreading faster than resentment. The Americans could not sustain medical order alone. In one captured hospital near Würzburg, a U.S. Army surgeon named Captain Robert Hall recorded in his journal, We entered the surgical ward, about 20 German nurses still at post, no physician in command. They expected a rest. Instead, we asked them to stay. They looked stunned. Some began to cry. We needed them, but I don't think they understood why. What unfolded across occupied Germany in those first months of peace was a fragile coexistence built on necessity. The Americans provided medical supplies and oversight. The Germans, technical skill and endurance. The dynamic was tense, but gradually a strange rhythm emerged. The women who had once treated Luftwaffe pilots now handed scalpels to American surgeons operating on GIs. The same hands that had tended to the Reich soldiers were now saving the lives of the men who had defeated them. For the nurses, the emotional toll was immense. Their uniforms, once symbols of national pride, had become marks of guilt. Some refused to wear them, preferring civilian clothes. Others kept them on as a quiet act of identity, though they avoided eye contact with the Allied officers. In many camps and hospitals, interpreters were scarce. Commands were given through gestures and tone, a pointing hand, a nod, a word repeated in broken English or hesitant German. Scalpel, clamp, gauze. Over time, those words became bridges across the chasm of ideology. Medical ethics also played a silent role in this transformation. The Americans, guided by the Geneva Convention and the Army's own moral code, treated German wounded and civilians with an impartiality that surprised many. Reports from the U.S. 116th Evacuation Hospital noted, captured German nurses exhibited fear and confusion at being permitted to continue work. Their discipline was precise, their fear palpable. Cooperation improved significantly after initial contact. For the Americans, this cooperation was practical. For the Germans, it was existential. Many of these women had lived under a regime that blurred morality with obedience. To be told to care for an enemy, and then allowed to do so freely, broke that conditioning. It revealed a world where healing transcended allegiance. In the weeks following the surrender, hundreds of such joint medical operations took place across southern Germany. The U.S. 21st General Hospital in Munich took over a former Luftwaffe infirmary. At the same time, German Red Cross units were repurposed under Allied supervision. The transformation was swift, but the emotional unease lingered. American nurses, too, faced their own internal struggles. Many had treated the survivors of concentration camps. Their compassion was balanced with fury, but when they looked at their German counterparts, pale, underfed, shaking, they saw not monsters but broken human beings. The realization unsettled them. One American nurse, Lieutenant Ruth Lewis, later recalled, "They were terrified of us. They stood at attention like prisoners waiting for punishment. When we told them to scrub in, one of them nearly fainted. I remember thinking, my God, they don't know what mercy looks like." Every shared surgery, every passing of a needle or thread became an act of fragile reconciliation. Not through speeches or forgiveness, but through repetition, the daily, relentless work of keeping people alive. Outside the hospital walls, the world was falling apart. Refugees flooded roads, POSU camps filled by the hour, disease spread through the wreckage of burned-out towns. And yet, inside those makeshift surgical rooms, something miraculous began to take shape. Cooperation without hatred. The surgeons didn't speak of peace. They simply practiced it, and in that quiet, sterile space where light cut through broken windows and instruments gleamed faintly in the pale Bavarian sun, the nurses began to unlearn fear. One operation, one patient, one shared act of care at a time. The moment that would test that fragile trust came suddenly. A battlefield casualty rushed in. An American soldier clinging to life, and a German nurse ordered to assist. The same woman who had once tended German soldiers now stood beside an American operating table. The war might have been over, but for her, the true battle, the one between guilt, duty, and humanity, was only beginning. Inside the commandeered hospitals of southern Germany, time lost meaning. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and burned flesh, a mixture that clung to the walls and to memory. The front lines had vanished, but the wounds they left behind were still raw and open. German nurses, now under American authority, worked in silence, their movements mechanical, their eyes lowered. They had lived through years of rigid discipline, where mistakes were punished and emotion was weakness. But in these new wards, everything felt inverted. The Americans spoke with a tone that was firm but not cruel. Orders were given, not barked. Mistakes were corrected, not punished. And that, more than anything, unsettled them. For the American doctors, it was a strange partnership. They had spent years fighting an enemy that had turned medicine into a weapon. Physicians who had experimented on prisoners, nurses who had assisted in sterilizations or euthanasia programs. The line between healer and accomplice had been blurred beyond recognition. Yet now here they stood, side by side with women who shared their vocation. Women who looked exhausted, emaciated, and human. In the first days, suspicion ruled everything. The Germans feared retaliation. The Americans feared sabotage. But soon necessity dulled ideology. There were too many wounded, too many infections, and too few hands. The rhythm of surgery erased words. A gesture replaced a command, a nod replaced trust. The first time a German nurse handed an American doctor a scalpel without trembling, it was not a grand gesture of reconciliation. It was survival becoming habit. In one field hospital outside Nuremberg, a U.S. lieutenant surgeon later wrote, "They were efficient to the point of silence. We worked 6 hours together without a word spoken, only the sound of instruments and heartbeats. It was the closest thing to peace I'd felt since the Ardennes." What shook the German women most was the difference in how the Americans treated them. They had been taught to expect punishment, degradation, perhaps worse. Instead, they were given clean uniforms, rations, and beds. When a young nurse hesitated to sit beside an American woman in the mess tent, believing she wasn't allowed, the nurse beside her laughed softly and pulled out a chair. That simple gesture, eating together, carried more weight than any speech. It defied every warning the Nazi regime had fed them about the cruelty of the enemy. Still, not all moments were tender. There were tears, breakdowns, and long silences filled with shame. Some American soldiers refused to look at the Germans at all, haunted by memories of camps like Dachau and Buchenwald. Others found themselves confused by their own empathy. The human face of the enemy was hard to reconcile with the atrocities still being uncovered just miles away. One American doctor stationed near Munich wrote in his notes, "I wanted to hate them. But how do you hate someone sewing sutures with shaking hands, saving a man's life as if her own depended on it?" Among the German nurses, guilt was a constant unspoken presence. Many had treated SS officers or worked in military hospitals that supplied the front lines. Some had seen the results of the regime's crimes but had been powerless, or too afraid to object. Now standing beside Allied doctors, they began to understand how much had been hidden from them. When news of the concentration camps began to spread, disbelief turned to horror. In the break rooms of those occupied hospitals, American medical staff would unfold photographs, skeletal survivors, mass graves, the unmistakable symbols of evil made real. Some nurses wept openly, others denied. A few fell silent for days. One wrote in her post-war diary, "We thought we were serving our country, but now I see we were serving madness." And yet, amid that reckoning, something deeper unfolded. The Americans did not demand repentance, they demanded competence. For the first time in years, these women were judged by their skill, not their ideology. A nurse who once feared failure under Nazi scrutiny now found herself praised for her steadiness during surgery. Another, who had never been spoken to as an equal by a male superior, was asked for her opinion on a wound. The shock of respect was almost as jarring as defeat. The social contrast was profound. American hospitals were staffed by both men and women, working side by side, something unthinkable in Nazi Germany, where gender hierarchy extended even into medicine. For the German nurses, seeing female American officers command operating rooms and issue medical orders was like witnessing another world. Some could not hide their astonishment. They called her lieutenant, one nurse recalled years later, and no man argued. It was a revelation that authority could be shared, that professionalism could transcend gender. Many of those moments left lasting impressions on the women who would later rebuild Germany's post-war medical system. The cultural divide extended into everything: posture, speech, even the way the Americans handled the dead. While German protocol demanded rigid formality, often reciting prayers or maintaining silence, American medics covered bodies quickly, with a quiet practicality born from endless exposure. To the Germans, this seemed cold at first, but soon they understood it wasn't indifference. It was the only way to survive emotionally after so much loss. Each day blurred into the next. Operations ran from dawn until midnight. Supplies arrived in crates stamped U.S. Army Medical Department. Plasma, penicillin, and sulfa drugs flowed into places that had run dry for months. The German nurses were stunned by the abundance. Antibiotics, sterile gloves, fresh bandages. To them, these were luxuries beyond imagination. They had spent years reusing surgical tools and rationing anesthesia, often operating with nothing but morphine and willpower. The Americans, though battle-weary, seemed to them like healers from another age. Trust grew slowly. The Americans began to leave smaller tasks unsupervised. Wound cleaning, temperature checks, post-op care. The Germans carried them out with precision. When infection rates dropped, credit was shared quietly. For the first time, cooperation wasn't forced by ideology but driven by shared purpose. In a world drowning in loss, healing became its own language. Outside, Germany was unrecognizable. Cities were skeletons of stone. Bridges gone, roads broken, families scattered. The hospitals were among the few places where structure remained, fragile but functional. It was within those sterile corridors that some of the earliest seeds of post-war reconciliation took root. The cooperation between American and German medical staff became a small model of what the world might one day become. Enemies working side by side, not because they forgot the war, but because they had no choice but to rebuild life after it. For the German nurses, that rebuilding began internally. They had been told that duty to the fatherland was sacred. Now they were discovering a different kind of duty, to humanity itself. The shift was painful but profound. Every patient, whether German or American, became a quiet redemption. One nurse later wrote, "Each wound I cleaned felt like washing away a part of my past." The Americans, too, found something they hadn't expected. Beneath the enemy uniforms and accents, they saw people scarred by the same war, shaped by the same loss. Some friendships emerged, tentative at first, then genuine. Letters were exchanged after demobilization. A few even continued correspondence for years, a strange testimony to the resilience of empathy. But beneath that fragile cooperation, shadows remained. The weight of atrocity could not be erased by kindness alone. The Americans knew that. The Germans knew it more deeply. When rumors spread of war crimes trials beginning in Nuremberg, fear returned to the wards. Many of the nurses wondered if they too would be judged. Some had worked in military hospitals attached to units later accused of crimes. Others simply carried guilt by association. But in those final months of occupation, judgment gave way to exhaustion. Justice would come later. For now, there were still lives to save. The true turning point came one night when an American surgical team was short-staffed during a mass casualty evacuation. Dozens of wounded were brought in after a transport crash, both German prisoners and Allied soldiers. Without hesitation, the German nurses stepped forward. They didn't wait for permission. They cleaned wounds, applied tourniquets, and assisted through the night. When dawn broke, over 30 men had survived who otherwise would not have. No speeches were made, but something fundamental had shifted. From that day, the Americans no longer called them prisoners. They called them nurses. The war had divided nations, ideologies, and souls. But inside those hospital walls, the act of healing did what politics never could. It reintroduced humanity to itself. The American doctors who had entered Germany with hardened hearts began to soften. The German nurses who had lived in fear began to stand upright again. The sterile light of the operating room became, in its quiet way, the first light of reconstruction. Outside, the war crimes trials were drawing near. Germany's reckoning was only beginning, but for those women in white, who had faced humiliation, guilt, and unexpected mercy, the transformation had already begun deep within. They had seen what real compassion looked like. They had assisted in surgeries not under a swastika, but under a new moral order, one that valued life above ideology. And as the war-torn nation began to rebuild, many of those same nurses would become the backbone of post-war German medicine, women who learned in defeat what true duty meant. Night fell over the makeshift American hospital in Bavaria, the kind of night that felt endless, heavy, windless, almost sacred in its silence. The building had once been a small Lutheran school. Its walls, still bearing bullet holes, now echoed with the sound of moans and muffled commands. Outside, a soft rain began to fall, tapping against shattered glass, mingling with the hum of the field generator. Inside, Dim tungsten lamps cast long shadows over the operating tables. On one of them lay a German prisoner of war, an SS officer unconscious, pale from blood loss. The room was tense. American doctors surrounded him, gloves slick with antiseptic. The nurses assisting them were German, women once bound by oath to the Reich. Their faces were pale, their eyes downcast, but their hands were steady. The irony of the moment hung in the air, the enemy saving the enemy. An American medic muttered under his breath, "He probably killed half our men." The surgeon didn't respond. He just said, "Scalpel." The command was answered by a quiet, trembling "Ja" as a German nurse handed him the instrument. For a moment, history itself seemed to hold its breath. This was the climax of contradiction, the place where morality, duty, and the wreckage of war collided. Outside, victory parades were being planned in Paris and London. But here, in this forgotten hospital, there was no celebration. Only the sound of breath and the slow ticking of a wall clock. These women had once served a regime that called Americans monsters. Now they were standing shoulder to shoulder with them, keeping another human being alive. As the operation dragged on, the air grew heavy with heat and tension. Sweat rolled down the American surgeon's temple, mixing with dust. The German nurse on his right was pale but calm, wiping his forehead with a sterile cloth before returning to her station. When the officer's pulse began to fade, she stepped forward instinctively, applying pressure with both hands, whispering a prayer under her breath. The American glanced at her, then back at the wound. There was no time for politics, only hands, blood, and survival. When it was over, hours later, the officer lived, barely. The American doctor slumped into a chair, staring at his gloves. The nurse stood across from him, her face blank but her eyes glistening with something unnameable. Relief, maybe. Or guilt. No one spoke. The rain outside had stopped, leaving behind a soft stillness that felt too fragile for the world they were in. That night marked a turning point, not just in that hospital, but in hundreds like it scattered across occupied Germany. The Americans began to see the German nurses differently. They were no longer just remnants of a defeated nation. They were colleagues bound by the shared exhaustion of endless suffering. For many of the nurses, this was the first time they had been treated as equals, not subordinates or tools of the state. It was unsettling, even overwhelming. But the emotional climax came days later, when an American nurse, Lieutenant Helen Curtis, collapsed from exhaustion during a 36-hour shift. Without hesitation, one of the German nurses, a woman named Liesel Müller, stepped forward to take over her duties. She worked tirelessly, tending to soldiers who wore the same uniforms that had occupied her homeland just weeks earlier. When Helen woke up, she found Liesel asleep in a chair beside her, her hands still stained with iodine. For a long time, neither said a word. Then Helen offered her a cigarette. Liesel accepted. Two women from opposite sides of the most destructive war in history shared a quiet smoke under the broken window of a bombed-out hospital, and for the first time, they smiled. It was these small, wordless acts that defined the climax of this story. Not explosions or speeches, but moments where compassion defied logic. One day, when a shipment of medical supplies ran short, the Americans allowed the German nurses to improvise. They crafted splints from broken furniture, sterilized instruments over open flames, and used torn sheets as bandages. The ingenuity impressed even the most hardened of the American officers. Respect grew silently, built not from forgiveness but from necessity and human decency. Yet amid the healing, the moral fractures of war still loomed. News of the Nuremberg trials began to spread, echoing through the hospital corridors. Photographs of concentration camps circulated among the staff, the liberated horrors of Dachau, Belsen, and Auschwitz. The American personnel reacted with fury and disbelief. The German nurses reacted with silence and tears. Many could not bear to look. Some confessed that they had believed the propaganda, that the camps were work facilities, not places of death. Others said nothing, their faces masks of unbearable shame. Tension returned to the wards. Some American medics refused to be assisted by German women at all. One night, a fight broke out in the mess hall, a soldier shouting that he wouldn't eat food served by them. The German nurses stood apart, too humiliated to defend themselves. But the next morning, when that same soldier was brought in with shrapnel in his chest, the nurse who treated him was one of the same. Her hands didn't hesitate. She worked until his breathing steadied, then stepped back without a word. The surgeon later said, "That was the moment I realized mercy doesn't wear a flag." In the following weeks, the hospital became more than a place of recovery. It became a laboratory of moral repair. Each surgery was an act of reconciliation. Each dressing change a reminder that healing was possible even among ruins. The German nurses began to regain something that had been stripped from them by years of indoctrination: their sense of self. For so long they had been told their value came only through obedience. Now they were learning that dignity could also come through service, compassion, and redemption. One of the most haunting scenes took place in late July 1945. A convoy of wounded civilians, both German and Allied, arrived from a nearby village that had been hit by leftover mines. Among them was a small boy, his leg nearly torn off. The German nurses rushed to help, their discipline automatic. The American doctors joined them, working side by side without a word. When the operation ended, and the boy's life was saved, the nurses stepped outside into the courtyard. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of blood still clinging to their aprons. One of them whispered, "We're finally doing something good." The climax of their journey was not about forgiveness nor even acceptance, it was about recognition. Recognition that humanity, stripped of politics and propaganda, still existed on both sides. In the silence of the post-war wards, where the cries of the wounded replaced the sound of artillery, the German nurses found a new form of purpose. They had once healed in service to a dictatorship. Now they healed in service to life itself. By August, the hospital had become an unlikely symbol of what post-war cooperation could look like. The Americans continued to oversee operations, but had begun to hand over responsibilities to local medical staff. The German nurses, many of whom had entered the war as young women indoctrinated by nationalism, were now leading wards, instructing others, and, most importantly, seeing patients as people, not symbols. One American officer described the transformation in a letter home. "They were terrified of us when we arrived, wouldn't look us in the eye. Now they run the wards with confidence. We've built something here that feels like peace." And yet, even amid this fragile peace, the weight of history lingered. Every smile, every handshake carried the memory of the millions who had perished. The women knew they could never erase that, but they could choose each day to live differently than before, to rebuild the moral fabric their nation had torn apart. It was in these dimly lit hospital rooms, surrounded by the ghosts of war, that the truest turning point of their lives unfolded. Not a victory in the field, but a quiet victory of conscience. The war had officially ended, but in the ruins of Germany it did not feel that way. The sound of gunfire had faded, yet the silence that followed was heavier than the noise it replaced. By autumn of 1945, the American-run field hospitals across Bavaria and Hesse began the slow process of demobilization. The wards that once overflowed with casualties were emptying. The beds once stained with blood now carried the faint smell of disinfectant and ash. And among those preparing to leave were the German nurses, women who had lived through the collapse of their nation, and who now faced an uncertain world that saw them as both victims and accomplices. For months, they had worked beside American doctors, their hands guided by habit, their hearts pulled between gratitude and shame. Now, as orders came for repatriation, the nurses stood in the courtyard of the hospital, lined up beneath a gray sky, clutching the meager possessions they owned. Their faces were thin, their uniforms worn to threads. The American commander, Colonel Harris, addressed them through an interpreter. He thanked them for their service, their discipline, and their courage. Then quietly he added, "The war made enemies out of all of us. But mercy makes us human again." Some of the women began to cry. For years they had been trained never to show emotion, to remain cold, efficient, obedient. Now the dam had broken. One nurse, Liesel Müller, the same woman who had once assisted in a desperate surgery under fire, pressed a trembling hand to her face. For the first time in her life, she felt seen not as a tool of a regime, but as a person. Yet the aftermath of war was rarely kind. When the nurses were released, many returned to towns that no longer existed. Their homes had been flattened, their families displaced or gone. In some places, civilians turned their backs on them, accusing them of betrayal for working with the Americans. "Collaborator," they whispered. Others accused them of being complicit in the crimes of the Reich. The uniforms they had once worn with pride now brought only humiliation. Some burned them in secret, watching the gray smoke twist upward like ghosts rising from the ashes of the Third Reich. For the American doctors, too, the end of the war brought an unexpected melancholy. They had fought, healed, and rebuilt, and now leaving felt almost like abandonment. Many of them had grown to respect their German counterparts, even to admire them. In their reports, they wrote of the discipline and skill of the German nurses, noting that without their help, hundreds of post-war civilians might have died from infection, starvation, or untreated wounds. One report from the 116th Evacuation Hospital read, "Their precision, calm, and endurance were invaluable. In compassion, they found redemption. But behind the professionalism lay deeper scars. The German nurses carried the burden of what they had witnessed under the Nazi regime. Many had served in military hospitals near concentration camps or in occupied territories. They had seen the consequences of ideology, not on a battlefield but on bodies. Some confessed in quiet moments that they had been blind. They had treated soldiers but never questioned what those soldiers had done before coming to them. Now those questions haunted their sleep. In the American hospitals, after the fighting stopped, psychiatric cases increased. Soldiers and civilians alike were treated for what the Americans called battle fatigue. The German nurses, though rarely diagnosed themselves, suffered from the same condition. Night after night they woke to phantom sounds, the whine of incoming shells, the smell of blood, the cries of the dying. But they kept working, helping the wounded, the displaced, and the children who wandered through the ruins searching for food. One of the most remarkable developments came in late 1946, when the U.S. Army Medical Corps began organizing joint medical programs to rebuild Germany's healthcare system. Many of the same German nurses who had served under occupation were invited to train under American supervision. This time they wore no insignia, just plain white uniforms. Their role had changed. They were now healers of a broken nation. In one training facility near Frankfurt, photographs captured something extraordinary. American and German nurses standing side by side, smiling faintly at the camera. The image circulated among Allied press as a symbol of reconciliation. But for the women in the photo, it was more than symbolism. It was a declaration that they would no longer be defined by the past. Still, not all wounds healed. Some American families wrote letters of protest upon hearing that their sons' doctors had worked alongside former enemies. For others, the collaboration became a quiet point of pride, proof that compassion had survived where hatred had failed. Colonel Harris himself wrote in a post-war interview, "I saw those women scrub floors, assist in surgery, and bury the dead. They never asked for kindness, only for a chance to be decent again. I gave them that." As Germany transitioned into a nation under Allied occupation, women formed the backbone of its recovery. Nurses, secretaries, and teachers became symbols of a country trying to restore its soul. In the ruins of cities like Dresden and Cologne, field hospitals evolved into permanent clinics. Some of the American medical staff stayed to help establish them. And when the first German-run hospitals reopened in 1947, many of the staff were those same women who had once trembled before Allied officers. They worked quietly, anonymously, never boasting of what they had endured. Their service was not celebrated. There were no medals, no parades, but their work mattered. Every life saved, every child treated, every wound closed brought a small piece of Germany back from the edge of moral extinction. By 1948, as the Marshall Plan began reshaping Europe, many of those nurses had found new lives. Some joined the Red Cross, others became midwives or teachers. A few even emigrated, to Canada, to Australia, to the United States, seeking to begin again in places where the past could not follow so easily. And yet, no matter where they went, the memory of those months in the American hospital stayed with them. It was the one place where they had seen humanity restored in its rawest form, not through ideology, but through the act of saving another's life. Years later, one former German nurse wrote in her journal, "The Americans did not humiliate us. They made us remember what it meant to be human. When they asked us to help, I was terrified. I thought they would punish me. But instead they gave me a purpose. That was the beginning of my freedom." The aftermath of war is often measured in borders and treaties. But in this story, it was measured in gestures. A scalpel passed across trembling hands, a wound stitched in silence, a moment of eye contact that said more than forgiveness ever could. These women, once servants of a fallen ideology, became witnesses to the rebuilding of conscience itself. And as the hospitals finally closed and the last American medical units departed, the wards fell silent once more. The echoes of footsteps faded into the distance, leaving behind only the smell of ether, the soft rattle of an empty gurney, and the lingering warmth of what had once been mercy among enemies. Years later, the buildings where the American and German medical teams had once worked together still stood, cracked, overgrown, and silent. Grass pushed through the broken stone paths, ivy crawled up the walls, and the rooms that once smelled of blood and antiseptic now held only dust and echoes, yet if one stood quietly, the past could still be felt there. The hum of a generator, the soft murmur of nurses moving between beds, the faint clatter of instruments. It was as if the walls remembered the sound of healing in the midst of ruin. The story of those German nurses and the American doctors who worked beside them was never celebrated in parades or textbooks. It was too quiet, too human for grand retelling, but it lived in the lives that followed, in the children who survived because of those hands, in the women who rebuilt clinics out of rubble, in the doctors who learned that compassion is not a weapon of nations but a bond of souls. What had begun in fear and humiliation ended in dignity. War strips people of identity. It reduces nations to uniforms, faces to enemies. Yet in the aftermath, in those moments when one human being chooses to help another regardless of what they once believed, history finds its truest redemption. The nurses who had once bowed to tyranny found a new kind of strength, not in obedience but in mercy. And the Americans who had come as victors discovered that victory meant little without understanding. In the long shadow of war, their shared work became a quiet testimony that even among ruins, humanity endures. The scalpel, the bandage, the steady hand, these became the instruments of peace. And in those dim hospital wards where enemies once stood face to face, something greater than surrender had taken place. It was forgiveness without words, compassion without reward. The war had ended, but in that brief, fragile cooperation, something eternal had begun.